Our first speaker at the final session. Gavin Bella is a trainee ranger, local with the Brecon Beacons National Park, but he's also got a real passion for sound and for music, and where that's taken him is in a surprising way, in a study of mimicry in birds, and he's going to tell us how that can influence the breeding success of birds. So, Gavin, all yours.
Am I on? Can you hear me? Right, yeah, so is it Adrian? Julian, it was close. Thanks, Julian. So yes, let's go straight to the next slide. I graduated in the University of South Wales in Newport, having studied creative sound and music, and I have a passion for biomusicology and bioacoustics. So yeah, sound recording and wildlife photography is pretty much what I spend most of my spare time doing, especially sound recording with regards to the mimicry that I'm going to be talking about. I volunteer for Gwent Wildlife Trust and Land Eckford Reservoir, and I'm a training warden at Brecon Beacons National Park. So during my degree in university, I gave birth to a project called Rhythm of Birdsong, and everything that I'm going to talk about today came off the back of this project. It was a music-based project, so it wasn't sort of gearing towards this way, but it did end up, well, it helped me discover a few things about mimicry that I didn't know before. So I have a tiny speaker here, so you're going to have to bear with the sound. I hope you're going to be able to hear everything. If not, I do apologise. But yeah, that's terrible. Yeah, I'm not going to try that. So my job for Rhythm of Birdsong was to try and identify our origins of music. So we are ourselves are mimickers, and my aim was to try and track back through a history of music to see whether there are any elements of birdsong in our own music. So I was studying a lot about natural rhythm and also studying birdsong at microscopic level with use of sonograms and visual spectrums. I also slowed down bird songs to help me learn more about the origins of music, and this required a lot of sound recording, as where I found a lot to do with mimicking birds. I'll skip that bit because the sound's terrible. So what's mimicry? Wikipedia describes mimicry as the action or skill of imitating someone or something. I think they're sort of gearing it towards us more than birds, obviously, but especially in the order to entertain and ridicule. You wouldn't think that entertainment and ridicule would be part of bird world, but I found that it actually is. And there are two types of mimicry that I've identified. First of which is called static, or what I've called static, which is compulsory. From that you get creative elements, but the static part of that mimicry is what gives the bird their identity. This more interesting part of this mimicry is the purposeful mimicry, which I'll give some examples of later in the talk. From that you can get mutual advantage mimicry, and also mimicry used for deception, which is the interesting one that people tend to find more than anything else, or identify more than anything else. So, chiffchaffs. We haven't given chiffchaffs a great name today, especially with the Iberian chiffchaff. Everybody frowned upon them. They're not known to be mimicking species, but they do use static mimicry quite well. In fact, I'd even go as far as saying that they are the best at using static mimicry, and what I mean by that is, if I can show you the sound, you can barely hear that. So it sounds like two notes, but there isn't, and we've named it chiffchaff because we think there's two notes going on, but there isn't. There's usually four, and the notes that are used in between are never used in the same order. So chiff-chaff is a bad name. It could be chaff-chiff. But so yeah, they use static mimicry, and as a result, they need to be creative with that in order to stand out from rival males. So the goal of a chiff-chaff is to use static mimicry as creatively as possible. We call this linear improvisation, and the goal is to never sing those 2 or 3 or 4 notes in the same order. So in that case, they're quite remarkable in that they don't actually ever sing those notes in the same order. So yeah, that's the creative part, and during that they use a lot of improvisation. So to a female chiff-chaff, the creative part of the song is the most important, as that portrays knowledge and experience, all of which are required for successful breeding and therefore a desirable trait. This usually comes in with age and sexual maturity, so a first-year chiff-chaff won't stand as good of a chance as one that's sort of maybe 2 or 3 years old. Skipping that. So purposeful mimicry is, well, a good example of that is found in a jay, actually, and corvids are known for doing this, but they are, as most of you would probably already know, they're very good mimickers, often mimicking the sounds of buzzards, goshawks, and other predator-like birds. The reasons why they do this is debated, but personally I believe it to be a technique for the purpose of deception. Jays, as you already know, are quite intelligent, like many other corvids, and making the sounds of predators is a perfect way to scare off other species away from food, and this may even actually keep true predators at bay by mimicking the sounds of those predators. So that is found in quite a lot of corvid species, and I'll move on. I'll come back to that actually, because there's an interesting study on that. This study, however, is in the City College in New York. You would have heard this interpreted in many ways, and it helps try and identify how birds learn to sing. So these zebra finches were brought up and raised in complete isolation, and in doing so, they weren't able to sing like a normal zebra finch. They needed their parents, or they needed other zebra finches in order to learn their song. So this absence of static mimicry, in this case, deformed their very identity. But there was a safety blanket in place, so after several generations of imperfect song lineage, eventually they did end up sounding similar to a wild zebra finch. With a bit of improvising from the birds, they were able to use something called the unique filtering system to correct any imperfections in their song over a period of time. So the unique filtering system is what I'm going to be talking a lot about, actually. It's not something you can find written, but I'll try and explain it as best as I can in a minute. So every bird has their own unique sound filter. This sound filter goes hand in hand with, well, usually goes hand in hand with their vocal abilities. So a corvid, for instance, has a lower sound frequency to a blackbird, and therefore able to mimic lower frequencies, but I'll get onto that in a minute. So first, in order for a bird to mimic, they have to listen, and then obviously the learning part has to take place, and then there is elements of improvisation then with what they've learned, but they do all this through a filtering system. And the best way I could explain this filtering system is like this. So on the left hand side you've got environmental sounds, so this could have been anything. I've used a car as an example. Down the bottom of the screen you've got low frequencies, in this case the sound of car exhaust, and then right to the top, high would be like the squeaking sounds of your car brakes. So it all starts with sound, in this case the sound of urban environment. With the increase in sound of vehicles, we are going to get a lot more mimicking of these sorts of things in urban environments. So this is a blackbird's unique filtering system, and as you can see, they're filtering more so towards the top end of the scale, And in this case, a car alarm fits perfectly in with their unique filtering system. Again, repetition plays a part in this. If they keep hearing the sounds of car alarms, they will eventually learn them, so long as it fits inside their unique filtering system. If it fits outside of that, they tend not to mimic those sounds. You'll also get in that a variation in species. So this is a raven's unique filtering system, and as you can see, the car alarm slightly falls outside of their filtering system, but they can mimic stuff that's a lot lower pitch. So they'll tend to mimic stuff. Not quite a car horn. I don't think I've ever heard a raven mimic a car horn, but they are known to mimic other sounds in low frequencies. I'll come back to that, I think. So this has brought me to improvisation. So I mentioned first they need to hear, then they need to learn, and then they need to improvise. And what they do with this improvisation is quite impressive. And this project, I'll show you, is distinguishing improvisation from dialect. Right, so this guy's name is Pavel Pipik. I think I said that right. He's from the Czech Republic, and he's done a huge study on yellowhammers. It's a fantastic study. It shows the difference of dialect found in the Czech Republic and in the UK, some of which helps separate dialect from mimicry. It's quite difficult to do, because dialect can be extremely variant. But as you can see, I think he's identified over 12, some of which are categorized, some of which are not. So yellowhammers aren't, that I know of, prime examples of mimickers, but evidence found in this PhD by Pavel shows dialect like we've never had before. And I think before we really get to understand mimicking, we first must learn as much as possible about dialect, because well, there's a big debate about the difference between crossbills in Scotland and found in further down in the country, whether they are actually Scottish crossbills or not. And the reason why there's a debate is because they sound differently and they have different dialect. And this dialect is clearly shown in front of you. In the UK, we have more of the XIB dialect, and that's more so in the southern parts of the UK. As we go up further, I think we start to creep in with BC, and also a mixed dialect, which is marked by white. That would be birds that are on the fringes of dialect. So, to the left they've got birds singing XIB, and to the right they may have birds singing BC. So they've caught up in two different dialects. But it was interesting to find so many different dialects, and it'd be interesting to see if we could put this type of study to other birds in the UK to see how much of a variety of dialect we have in individual species. So the uncategorized dialect in this project are the bits that more interest myself, because this shows area of improvisation, something that can't be notified, something that never happens twice, something that makes it really hard for people like me who would like to sort of learn more about mimicking. That, I think, in my opinion, is the key to find a little bit more about the mimicking species. So why should we be more aware of what we hear? That's the part of the title that people are probably scared about, actually. But I've got a little quiz, so I'm going to play a sound, and I do apologise for the sound. You'll have to try your best to listen to this. But I'd just like you to guess what you think that bird is. Okay? So I'm sure there's plenty of people in here that are going to be hot on this. That was terrible, wasn't it? I'll do it again. Any ideas? Not quite. I'm going to keep going. Something common. Alright, somebody said blackbird. Yeah, you're closer to the speaker, that's probably why. Right, so you guessed blackbird, and it does, when heard through great speakers, it does sound exactly like a blackbird, I promise you. It's not a blackbird. It's actually a reed warbler. The next one, so I have 3 of these. I hope this sounds a little bit better. You have to get this. Anybody guess that one? That's a blue tip. I'm so glad you got that one wrong. So that's a reed warbler as well. And the next one. This one I quite like. So I'll go back. And did everybody hear that, especially at the back? Any ideas what that one is? Right, you're onto it now, I think. So that was a reed warbler as well. It was mimicking a swallow, by the way. That was the sort of overhead song of the swallow. But not just all. That was actually the same reed warbler, funny enough. That was in the same recording. But how do we know? If we just hear that on its own, it would be quite difficult as birders to distinguish that sound away from the actual bird. But there are mechanisms in place that we have caught onto as birders that help us identify the species, and we can usually tell. I mean, I don't think anybody's mistaken a reed warbler for a blackbird in the field, but the reason why is because they use these sounds collectively. They never usually sing them in the same context as a blackbird. They're using these sounds to make something new. As part, whether that be as part of static mimicry passed down from their parents or from other birds, or whether that's what I like to call purposeful mimicry, whether there's an actual reason for using that, is what I would like to know. So how does mimicry influence breeding success? Well, for chiff-chaff, that static mimicry, the purpose of using that is just to improvise, and I use that word linear. It was just to be as creative as possible. So for a chiff-chaff, static mimicry is quite important to breed. To be successful in breeding as a breeding male, you need to be good at improvising. For birds that use the corvid type, the purposeful mimicry, possibly birds not like the grasshopper warbler, but like the reed warbler, that takes sections of other birds' song. That is where it becomes interesting. Oh, let's go back a minute. Or did it end?
No, that was the end.
I'll go back. That's fine. Let's catch up here. So yeah, having shown you different types of mimicry, I hope you can understand why it's a difficult question to answer. Every single species uses mimicry in a different way. The importance of mimicry is different for every single species. Birdsong alone, without mimicry, has the power to influence and stimulate nest building behaviour, and even boosts the growth of the egg inside the ovaries. This even gives mimicking birds the potential power to control breeding habits of other species around them. These levels of control that we're only now beginning to start to understand, but we must first learn, listen and improvise. I think that's the most important part here is I think on an individual species level, it can be done. You can find out the differences between non-mimickers breeding success and the mimickers breeding success and compare it that way, but collectively it's very difficult. But if you have any questions, especially about the filtering system, I'm happy to answer them now, and I will go back to the filtering system if there's anything about that you don't understand. I wonder whether I can get it up there. Was there anything about this that people didn't understand? Or was it self-explanatory? Nobody understood it.
You didn't want to say it.
Right, so the unique filtering system, if I recorded a blackbird and physically looked at it on a sonogram, it would show frequencies up in this area. They've just disappeared. Where's that gone? I'll have to skip that through, shall I? Might be. Sorry, we'll get there eventually. Wait, here we go. Right, so if I recorded a blackbird and looked at its sonograph, it would show frequencies up in this area. It may show peaks up in the very high frequencies, and it may show peaks in the lower frequencies. You can actually work out a bird's unique filtering system by studying a collective amount of blackbird songs. So if they don't produce frequencies and notes, if you're musical, if they don't produce notes there, for instance, we know that they are not able to mimic notes of that frequency. If they are using frequencies in the lower register, it might take more energy required from the bird to use those notes. It won't use those notes very often. So this you can usually tell a unique filtering system by studying its song, and therefore the environment sounds come in. When the environment sounds come in, you can usually tell what sort of sounds they are likely to mimic, if that makes sense. So it would be a good study in urban environments if you're worried about the impacts of the sounds of urban environments on mimicking species. You could record an urban environment, see what sort of frequencies fit within the local bird's unique filtering system, and hopefully you might be able to mitigate that. And unlikely, but you might be able to to help sort those problems out. Same with the corvid and the ravens. They are known to mimic, but their mimicking register falls a little bit lower than our typical blackbirds. So they're more likely to mimic sort of, I mean, even the sound of the car exhaust, it's not just the low rumble of a car exhaust that they would like to mimic. Some exhausts have a clankering sound, a knock-in noise, which might fall a little bit higher up on the register, so they will start to use those sort of sounds as well, and all for the purpose of purposeful mimicry. If they need to, the way they learn is they need to hear something more than 10 times, I think, and over extended periods of time. So it would take a while for a blackbird to learn a car alarm. You'd have to have an annoying neighbour who keeps forgetting to turn his car alarm off for a blackbird to start mimicking a car alarm. But my street's a good example, actually. My next door neighbour likes to whistle a lot. He's a churchgoer. Every Sunday he comes home whistling church hymns. And all of my local blackbirds have taken a section of that. But that's only because he's frequent in the way he whistles, and he's quite on it with the tone, so he's pretty good. So yeah, that's a good way of learning how old your local blackbirds are. Try and latch on to those mimicking phrases, and you could actually tell how old your local blackbirds are. If you keep listening and listen hard, you can actually tell. Mine's 3 years old.
Can I ask you a question related to that? Gavin?
Yeah.
Is that all right? Yeah. There's that Australian bird, is it a bellbird?
Lyrebird.
Lyrebird. Chainsaw,
Yeah.
camera clicks and so on.
Exactly.
Does it really well.
Yeah.
How is it that we haven't got a British bird that does that, if they're able to mimic them as you explained?
I think we do have British birds that do just as good as that.
Oh, really?
I think it's just harder for us to notice them, to be honest.
Okay.
Starling, I mean, everybody mentions starlings, everybody mentions marsh warblers is another good one.
I've
And
not heard starling do chainsaws, though.
no,
I know they do.
yeah, maybe. Well, usually it comes under that purposeful mimicry. I mean, the lyrebird is an extravagant example of mimicry. They use it in such a way that every sound around them is important to their breeding success. We have birds in the UK that do exactly that. Reed warblers, marsh warblers are just like that. They're just hard to notice. The way they use it in that linear fashion, they chop sections of other birds' songs. So to everybody, it just sounds like just their own, but it's not actually their own. It's probably another 15 other birds' songs.
Time for one more question for Gavin? I'll take the one in the middle there.
I just want to know whether these birds that are males, presumably, are good at mimicry. Do they breed better?
I think so. I mean, in the case of the chiff-chaff, that's a good question. I think they do breed better, yes. Learning the sounds of their environment has an impact on their breeding success. If a blackbird started mimicking lots of blue tits, it would naturally lure a lot of blue tits in that area. So that comes under purposeful mimicry. So they're using that as mutual advantage mimicry. So learning other birds around them, drawing other birds into that breeding area will improve its chances of survival, more eyes looking out for predators. It's also, they're probably specific in which birds they mimic, because they're not going to want to mimic another species that's eating the same food as them. So, I mean, a blackbird mimicking a blue tit would probably be a good thing, because they eat different foods. So yeah, that's a good question. It does.
I was thinking more of, say, the marsh tit.
Yeah. It's hard.
Many of those birds learn most of their alien songs, as it were, from the birds they are living with in Africa. So they come up to Europe, and within their song will be active species.
Exactly. Well, that's a good example. In fact, I think it was Rob at the very start that said we need to learn more about, I wrote it down, conserving migrating behaviour. This